Let's go to our panel now. We're joined from Tel Aviv by Danny Ayalon. Danny is Israel's former deputy foreign minister. He was once the ambassador to the United States. In Gaza, we have Mukhaimar Abu Sada. He's a professor of political science at Azhar University. And in Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, Omar Shakir is there for us. Omar is the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. Thank you to all three of you for your time. Danny, let's start with the very latest news, the political fallout from this. And Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's defense minister, resigning over a ceasefire. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he's gearing up for elections. He's been under a lot of criticism. He wasn't very relevant as a minister of defense. There was a direct line between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the chief of staff. He didn't bring anything to the job because he didn't have any experience in that, but mainly he was attacked by his own base. So I think he had no choice in his mind to do that. But I think it's backfiring because everybody says that this is not leadership, this is not responsibility. He is stepping down when things are not settled yet in Gaza. It's like shirking his responsibility and deserting battle. So
is the majority feeling in Israel that he's made the decision for the wrong reasons? In other words, people would rather see a ceasefire than a more hardline stance?
Absolutely. I think that also, if you look at the government, at the Prime Minister and the IDF, they really were very restrained and they tried their best to really alleviate any sorrow and the plights, both for Israeli on our side of the border and the people of Gaza. And hopefully this will end this violence because quite honestly, if Hamas will not upkeep their word or the silence, then Israel will have no choice but to retaliate. I hope we'll not get to that point.
Mukhaimar, Hamas calls the resignation of Lieberman a victory for the resistance, but what practical difference could this resignation make to the Palestinian people?
Well, let's look at it from a different angle. The Palestinians in Gaza, the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have been under Israeli siege and blockade for more than 11 years now. Poverty is about 70% among the Palestinians. Unemployment is more than 43% of the working force in the Gaza Strip. Access and movement of the Palestinians in and out of the Gaza Strip is very limited. The Palestinians, too, when you look at it, have not too much to lose out of what happened over the past 48 hours. Now the Palestinians see the top of Israeli defense establishment going down is definitely the Hamas and the Palestinians look at this as a victory. If it's not a military victory, it's definitely a symbolic victory that Lieberman, who has been calling for the destruction of Hamas for many years, was unable even to defeat Hamas, not to get rid of Hamas or to uproot Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Lieberman, who was a Minister of Defense for 2 years, and I agree with Danny Ayalon that Lieberman did not really bring anything to the job, did not bring anything to the position as a Minister of Defense in Israel. He very much failed miserably to deal with Hamas, to deal with the so-called security threat coming out from Gaza. And at the end of the day, his government just last week approved the transfer of $15 million to Hamas and to transfer of fuel for the Gaza power station. So there is a big difference between what Lieberman has been calling for, the destruction of Hamas, and the behavior of his ministry and the behavior of the Israeli government, which has been giving more life support for Hamas and its government in Gaza. That's what it looks like from a Palestinian perspective, that the government of Israel has failed miserably in the face of Hamas and the face of Palestinian resistance.
Okay, before we look at the latest violence and the possible effects that may have on any potential peace, Omar, just lay out for us in terms of international law, in terms of human rights, about whether either side has any justification for attacking each other over the past couple of days.
Absolutely. There have been apparently unlawful attacks carried out both by the Israeli army and by Hamas forces. Of course, we're still investigating these incidents, but what's very clear to start with is that the Israeli army has a record of using excessive force when it comes to Gaza, not only in the wars of 2014 and 2012 and 2008, but even what we've seen in the way they've policed the March of Return, where they've opened fire subject to orders at the highest level of the Israeli government, including Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, with authorized using lethal force against demonstrators who did not pose an imminent threat to life, which is the standard that's set out in international law. And again, initial reports suggest that at least two of those that were killed may not have been, in fact, combatants. One apparently was a farmer, another that was attempting to climb the fence, but who didn't apparently pose an imminent threat to life, as initial reports suggest. And on the other side, firing rockets indiscriminately towards Israeli civilian centers is a clear war crime. These are indiscriminate weapons that are targeting population centers, and there is no cause that can justify such attacks. And quite simply, this is all happening, as my previous colleague mentioned, in the context of Israel's effective closure of Gaza. For 11 years, it has effectively enacted a travel ban, preventing the entry and exit of people of goods subject to humanitarian exemptions, effectively turning the 11 by 40 kilometer Gaza Strip into an open-air prison, restrictions that far exceed what's allowed under international law. We continue to see the same cycle continue. And just a last point on the Lieberman resignation, I would actually agree with both of the two previous speakers. In fact, the Israeli army and security establishment has been very clear that the closure does not serve Israel's security interests. In fact, the former head of the army in charge of Kogat, which oversees the Gaza Strip, called for a Marshall Plan of Gaza. But in fact, Lieberman has pursued a policy to tighten the closure, restricting electricity, goods, and movement of people in a way that doesn't serve Israel's security, much less meet the basic minimum threshold in international law.
Danny, just picking up on one point out of all of those that Omar has made there, Israel's policing of the border with Gaza. There's more than 200 Palestinians who have been killed. The thousands upon thousands who have been injured, the vast majority have been killed or wounded by live Israeli fire, and most of them are innocent civilians. Sure, they're protesting, but they're civilians.
Well, I would say that really the ultimate responsibility lies with Hamas. It is true that for 11 years there are issues from getting in and out, but why is it? 11 years ago, Israel withdrew from Gaza to the last inch.
Yeah, but Danny, we're talking about this particular issue. Danny, seriously, we're talking about this one particular issue. A young female nurse, you can't blame Hamas for her being killed by an Israeli soldier's rifle or whatever weapon it was, a bullet entering her body and her being killed. So therefore, the policing of that border and what's been going on for the past few months there, could that be the reason for the culmination of Hamas firing these rockets, apart from the raid, which we have to talk about as well? But can you just address specifically the policing of that border and those more than 200 people killed and the thousands injured by live Israeli bullets?
Well, the policing of the border is quite legitimate with international law. The 55th article of the UN Charter is of self-defense. And again, we have been indiscriminately under fire. And we're talking about children and kindergartens and restaurants and so on and so forth. Yes, and also what we know that Hamas has sent their own people and pushed them towards our border, and also indiscriminately embedding among them some terrorists with firearms, with explosives, and some of them, just tried to cut, and some of them did manage actually to cut the fence on the border and just infiltrating into Israel. I don't think any country would have allowed that. We have had an arrangement with Hamas for the last 3-4 years, and last March they started with just pushing towards our borders, supposedly with the demonstrations, but that's okay. If they want to demonstrate, that's fine. They can do it in their own territory, but not in a menacing way with us. And I can tell you, our military and our government would really go out of their way to make sure that the Gazan people have all the rights and privileges that they are very much owed to and deserve as anyone else in the planet. But what is the problem? The problem is that the money that goes in and the cement and iron and all that is not used for building of schools or anything or buildings, but it is used for tunnels, underground tunnels, attack tunnels, to infiltrate and attack Israelis and kidnap Israelis. The problem, the plight of the people of Gaza is because the Hamas is not ready to really do away with the terror, to demilitarize. Once they demilitarize Gaza, I can assure you, Gaza will be open. And by the way, it's not just Israel closing their borders against terrorism, it's also Egypt. Egypt, the Rafah passage is also closed. Why? Because Hamas attacks.
Okay. Mukhaimar, what do you say to that?
Well, let me say to Danny, do not twist international law to your advantage. International law is clear here. International law does not give Israel and Israeli soldiers and snipers the right to shoot Palestinian civilians. As it was presented in this program, more than 200 Palestinian civilians have been killed since the start of the March of Return on March 30th of this year. Many of those who have been killed and gunned down by Israeli snipers were Palestinian children under the age of 16. Some of those who were killed were 2 Palestinian journalists, 1 Palestinian paramedic, and even Palestinian handicapped like Ibrahim Abu Thuraya was also gunned down by Israeli snipers. There is no such thing, you call it international law, that give Israel the right to shoot against Palestinian civilians and Palestinian protesters. If Israel wants to twist international law, that's a different thing. If Israel wants to behave as a rouge state, that's a different thing. Let's look at it. There are 2 million Palestinians surrounded in what is being described as the biggest open-air prison in the world, with 2 million Palestinians in a very small area, no more than 365 square kilometers, with poverty, unemployment, lack of electricity, lack of potable water, lack of access and movement. And let's not put the blame on Egypt. Israel is, according to international law, Israel is the occupying power over Palestinian territory, and Israel must be held responsible for the well-being of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, as well as the other 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. To try to put the blame on Egypt and say that Egypt is also blocking its borders, this is not an Egyptian responsibility. This is the responsibility of the Israeli occupation. And again, the source of all of this is Israel. You started by saying that Israel withdrew from Gaza. If Israel, as you just mentioned, Israel withdrew its soldiers and settlers from the Gaza Strip in September of 2005, then what was the Israeli unit doing in Gaza 3 nights ago when an Israeli unit was infiltrating in Gaza at about 10 p.m. nighttime? What was it doing?
Mukhaimar,
if Israel had withdrawn from Gaza, then Israel and Israeli army had no business to be in Gaza.
Okay, Mukhaimar, Danny, can you just give us your idea of what the reasoning might be for a ground operation by Israeli intelligence forces into the Gaza Strip at this time when it looked as if the two sides might be coming to some kind of agreement?
Well, simply put, is just a preemptive measure against firing at our population, civil population. And again, I would like to remind Omar, since we left in 2005. No more occupation. You cannot say any occupation because we left to the green line, the international line. But since we left, we hope this would change the entire dynamics. We hope that the Palestinians would answer in kind and come into negotiations and have peace, since we have no occupation there in Gaza anymore. But since then, we have been fired upon 11,000 rockets. And just in the last 8-9 months, you know, it's about 1,500 rockets. So when you do that, you have sometimes to preempt and to make sure that our children and our civil populations will not be a danger. Believe me, I do not want to see any siege on Gaza. I would like to see Gaza open like any other place. Somebody in the past said that Gaza really could be like the Singapore of the Mediterranean or of the Middle East, you know, because of its location and its beautiful beaches and sea and port and everything like that. I hope things will happen. But if Hamas would, you know, put down the arms and start really investing in the population, in the economy, in social programs, and will not push their people into our borders, then I think we will be in a much different position.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left. Omar, give us an idea from your organization's point of view and other international organizations where they, as neutrals, see common ground between the two sides that may eventually be able to revitalize some kind of process that we have been witnessing in the past few months between Israel and Hamas.
The first point to make here is, according to the UN, the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, most of the entire world, Gaza remains occupied by Israel. Israel controls the airspace, the water space, the borders, the entry and exit of goods. It controls the VAT tax. It controls a large no-go zone. It still registers every Palestinian baby born in the Gaza Strip as part of its population registry. The fallacy that Israel left and withdrew is simply untrue. It still maintains full effective control over the Gaza Strip. Danny mentions that this is all about security, but for many years, for example, Israel didn't allow the entrance in of margarine, industrial-sized margarine. It wasn't because margarine was going into tunnels or being fired as rockets. It was because it was part of a failed political strategy to starve Hamas. The cookie factory in Gaza was considered linked to Hamas elements. The point of the story is that's a failed political strategy, Lieberman being one of the main architects of it, and it was not based on Israeli security, which is why Israel's security establishment has been one of the largest advocates for opening up Gaza. Just another example, Israel allows tomatoes and eggplants to be exported out of Gaza, but not other fruit and vegetables. There is simply no security-based reason. Or tomorrow, someone from Gaza can potentially get a permit to do a surgery outside of Gaza, but if the next week, if they apply for a permit to study abroad or to attend go on vacation, they will be rejected because the closure policy doesn't let anyone in or out.
Okay, just in 30 seconds, Omar, where's the common ground? Is there any common ground? Very briefly.
It's ending the closure of Gaza in favor, opening up Gaza in favor of restrictions that are only based, instead of a generalized ban on travel, based solely on security considerations. End the closure of Gaza now.
Okay, and Danny, presumably you don't think that could ever happen unless Hamas lays down its weapons. Again, very briefly.
Well, yeah, I would like to see Gaza opened and the airspace and ports and everything else. But as long as you have these underground tunnels, as long as you have these launchers, as long as you have these rockets, and also these terrorist squads, what can you do? If they would lay down their arms, believe me, we would be very happy to see Gaza flourish. And I remember that when we left Gaza, it was the Palestinian Authority that took over. And then in a coup, Hamas threw out the Palestinian Authority. So this adds to the complexity of the situation. But if Gaza would be clean of terror and explosives, I have no doubt the Israeli government the next morning would open everything up.
Danny, Mukhaimar, Omar, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.